So now I'm going to transfer the cartoon. The cartoon, in fact, that I created like Raphael did, I've actually preserved as a kind of pristine piece of paper with all of its rendering. That's the one that's preserved in Milan at the Ambrosian Library. Now what I'm going to do is I've taken that and I've traced it and made a version that's going to be used to transfer the drawing onto the wall. The reason I did that is because if I really want to preserve that drawing, it's actually quite damaged by the lime on the wall. It's going to tend to corrode and eat away at the paper over time. Just as I did for the Sinopia, just to see how that works. And that's a method that was used throughout Raphael's time, but became less and less common around Raphael's time and with Michelangelo and afterwards, when the technique known as incisione, or basically incising a line by tracing the cartoon with some sort of a stylus. I'm using a mechanical pencil, but it'll push a little groove into the surface of the paper. It's much faster than the pouncing method. It doesn't actually transfer dots of color, so you don't really have to deal with the color, and it actually makes a kind of almost relief kind of line in the surface of the plate. Check, and I can see it. I have to look at it in breaking light, but I can in fact see it, and that's what really matters, because this is my guide for what I'm going to be doing today. So in painting, essentially the raw material here that I'm using are the pigments that are just pure powdered pigment, the basis for all paint materials, essentially, that in other cases always have some kind of a binder. So watercolor has gum arabic as a binder, oil paint can have linseed oil or walnut oil or some other kind of binding oil. For fresco, the critical thing is that the lime in the wall is actually the medium in a sense. I will brush these pigments on with just some water, typically mixing these just with water. Occasionally, and especially in the Tuscan fresco tradition, they used a little bit of lime water, so water that had a little bit of the lime putty in it, so it makes a kind of a thin, like a skim milk kind of consistency water that will actually dry the colors a little lighter. But they will bond especially well to the wall, because essentially the colors are being painted with the same stuff that the wall is made of. So I'm ready to paint. I've made myself a little test panel. I've tested out my colors. Raphael may or may not have had something like this, but at this point in the fresco of the School of Athens, he probably wasn't guessing anymore about the color of flesh tones. In this particular case, I'm trying out some colors. For the flesh tones, I'm going to be using raw sienna, a little bit of Venetian red, and then for some of the shadows, burnt sienna and burnt umber. These are my brushes. These are like the Platonic idea of a brush. These are the simplest, humblest, and probably almost unchanged since Raphael's time brushes that are still the traditional brushes used for fresco. It's basically a stick with bristles set around the point of the stick and then bound together with a wire or string of some kind. I mean, it doesn't get any simpler than this. And the reason that they're kind of a little rough and kind of humble like this is that you're basically painting on sandpaper. I mean, essentially you're painting on some sand and lime, and it's not the kind of thing that's going to be conducive to painting with fine sable brushes. You want to use relatively rough, crude brushes, and there are things about the technique that actually are facilitated by the brushes. For example, spreading the bristles, and especially working a little dry, you can get the kind of streaking that may exist in some of the shadows on the face of Heraclitus that we'll see, and I'll try to replicate that technique. But Raphael's going to start large. He's going to start with blocking in broad areas of color and work down to the details. It's the nature of fresco painting that over the course of the day, the lime and the plaster changes. Early in the day, there's a lot of lime on the surface, very limey kind of surface. Wonderful to paint in. You've got a lot of essentially medium on the surface, and that medium allows you to blend colors, make softer transitions. As the day goes on and the plaster is drying, and it tends to dry more rapidly, progressively over the course of the day, later in the day, the plaster is going to be accepting the pigments more quickly, which means you'll have less time to blend and sort of soften the transitions. And it'll also then facilitate working more precisely, working with maybe more linear forms, his eyebrows, for example, some of the darker lines in the shadows. So kind of a delineation might happen later in the day. It's also the time when you probably add some of the brightest accent. Now, my guess here is that, and I wasn't up there on the scaffolding with Raphael, so I'm guessing a little bit at what he did when he painted. And I'm guessing that in the shade side of his face, and it's really more shade than shadow, he actually painted a rather hot version of the flesh tone, and then overlaid a kind of a wash of shadow. So the thing about fresco is that it's a kind of commitment, and it requires a kind of confidence and a kind of pre-planning. That means that you don't really need to be inventing or experimenting too much on the wall, or you shouldn't be, because if you don't like what you've done and you want to change your mind, you have to chip off the plaster and replaster it and start all over again. Now, one of the techniques that Michelangelo seems to have used on the Sistine Ceiling, and it's certainly true that Raphael never saw Michelangelo painting, but neither did I. But I was up on the Sistine Chapel scaffolding when they were doing the restoration around the Libyan Sibyl. And we learned up there that Michelangelo was probably alternating between a smaller brushing in the colors, and then a large, fat, rather dry bristle brush that he would then use to dust out quickly. Or especially earlier in the day, it's easier to do the harsher transitions. And so he could actually blend a little bit up on the wall. That was in a way that was allowing him to get some sort of subtlety and rather gentle transitions. And it's one of the miracles of the Sistine Ceiling that Michelangelo, with this bold technique that he's using, is still able to get an incredible level of subtlety in blending of values. And so I'm going to essentially show you how to do that. And Raphael, again, didn't see him painting it, but he probably could figure it out for himself, knowing as much as he did about fresco.